Did Martin Luther anathematize himself? Well, the answer is yes, and the story is actually kind of funny or embarrassing depending on who you ask. So let's talk about it. Many people think Martin Luther's disputes with the Catholic Church centered around indulgences, and in a way that is true, but it's not because Martin Luther rejected indulgences. In fact, Martin Luther defends indulgences as we're going to go through in this video, but it was rather because Martin Luther saw that many Catholics didn't understand what indulgences were, and many Catholic priests were abusing this ignorance of the laity in order to enrich themselves, essentially. In fact, in Thesis 41 of his 95 Theses, Martin Luther says, "Papal indulgences must be preached with caution, lest people erroneously think that they are preferable to other good works of love." So we see here that Martin Luther isn't against indulgences, he's against them being misunderstood by the laity. And so he teaches that we should preach indulgences with caution, make sure that people are properly understanding them, because what Martin Luther calls out, if you read the 95 Theses, by the way, this is all throughout the 95 Theses, Martin Luther calls out repeatedly that people seek to receive indulgences more than they seek to actually do good acts of love to others or acts of prayerful devotion for the sake of prayerful devotion itself. So there was, according to Luther, there was a sort of obsession with receiving indulgences rather than doing good works, and he saw that people were treating it as a shortcut to not have to actually do good works or be prayerful or be devoted for the sake of actually being devoted or doing good works or being prayerful, but rather for people were doing these things for the sake of receiving some sort of a pardon from their sins. And so rather than getting rid of indulgences altogether, Luther wanted Christians to properly understand indulgences. He says in Thesis 56, "The true treasures of the church, out of which the Pope distributes indulgences, are not sufficiently discussed or known among the people of Christ." So rather than saying that indulgences should be gotten rid of, he says that they need to be better understood by the people of Christ. And as we see in this, and as we see in Thesis 56, he says that indulgences should be, they're not sufficiently discussed or known, meaning they should be discussed and known more among Christians. Not that they should be done away with, but that they should be known more by Christians and better understood by Christians. And you'll see also, if you read Martin Luther's small catechism and large catechism, that he had a big problem with the lack of catechesis among Catholics. And I talk about it in another video, which I'll link to up here, how this is still a big problem to this day that many Catholics don't understand the Catholic faith, and therefore they, have misunderstandings that they pass on to their children. Then their children, because of these misunderstandings, end up leaving the faith at times. So this is a big problem in the Catholic Church. It was back then. It is today. The Church has done a lot to improve this situation. We have a catechism now that's very, very comprehensive and beautifully written and very helpful in a lot of ways. And the Council of Trent produced a catechism that's also very good. So we have a lot of resources now, and there's no reason for Catholics to not be catechized properly now. But back in Martin Luther's time, this was one of his main gripes with Catholicism, is that these people don't understand our faith, and it's leading them to believe and practice a lot of wonky things, which, fair enough. Okay, fair enough, Luther. But later on in his 95 Theses, Luther also goes on to even defend indulgences. He says in Thesis 64, "On the other hand, the treasure of indulgences is naturally most acceptable." So again, many people have this misunderstanding that Luther was trying to get rid of indulgences, but rather Martin Luther calls them a treasure and says that they are naturally most acceptable. And I think a lot of people are often surprised when they find out what Martin Luther believes about a lot of things. If Protestants today were to read the 95 Theses, they would have a lot of problems with it. They would have a lot of disagreements with it. If they were to read what Martin Luther has said about Mary, they would have a lot of problems with that. He believed that Mary was sinless, that she's the mother of God, and that she was a perpetual virgin. John Calvin believed that she was a perpetual virgin. So what the reformers, traditional reformers, first believed is now rejected by most Protestants. It's really interesting to see how that has changed. But Martin Luther, back to indulgences, Martin Luther believed so strongly in indulgences that he even anathematized and accursed people who rejected indulgences. So he says in Thesis 71, quote, "Let him who speaks against the truth concerning papal indulgences be anathema and accursed." This is interesting for many reasons, but one of which is anathematizing somebody. That authority to anathematize or excommunicate somebody from the church doesn't rest with any specific priest or any specific, even layperson or theologian. This isn't language that we often hear among, for example, saints. Whenever we do hear saints talking about anathematization or anathematizing somebody, it's usually them quoting a council or something. But I don't. I tried to research. I couldn't. Maybe you can drop in the comments if I missed something, but I couldn't find any examples of a saint who was not a bishop or a pope or speaking at a council. Just a saint who is maybe a priest, a monk, or a layperson, a theologian. I couldn't find any example of a saint in those positions who anathematized anybody or who declared anathema anybody. So this is a really weird thing that Martin Luther is doing here to take on the authority to himself to anathematize people. Kind of strange. Um, I'm confused about why he thought he could do that. But tell me your thoughts in the comments. So yeah, who is Martin Luther to anathematize people? Now, while you won't be anathematized if you don't, it would still be greatly appreciated if you did like this video and subscribe to the channel and consider supporting over on Patreon. You'll get a lot of exclusive perks on Patreon, exclusive live streams, exclusive videos, early access to videos. Members saw this video early. So if you want to support Catholic content on YouTube, you can do so by going to Patreon. Thank you so much for everybody who is supporting over there, and appreciate it. Now, so Martin Luther anathematizes and accurses anybody who rejects indulgences. But then, just a couple years later, Martin Luther changes his mind on indulgences. So he wrote a work titled The Babylonian Captivity of the Church, and in the introduction or the preface to that work, he writes, quote, "Some 2 years ago I wrote on indulgences, but in such a way that I now deeply regret having published that little book. At that time I still clung with a mighty superstition to the tyranny of Rome, and so I held that indulgences should not be altogether rejected, seeing that they were approved by the common consent of so many." So Martin Luther is now saying he regrets writing so positively about indulgences. He regrets defending indulgences. Uh, that's kind of embarrassing. I mean, imagine if the church said, for example, let anyone who rejects that Mary is the mother of God be anathema. And then later, a couple years later, the church were to say, we kind of feel embarrassed about that. Never mind. Never mind. We're going to take that back. You would say, well, the church doesn't have much credibility then. I shouldn't follow this church if they're changing their mind and they're excommunicating people for things that they're very shortly after, recanting. That would be kind of embarrassing for the church. And I think in the same way, it's kind of embarrassing for Martin Luther, and it calls into question his credibility on a bunch of other things. If he could so strongly believe indulgences are so true that if you reject indulgences, you are anathema and accursed, you are excommunicated from true Christianity, you're excommunicated from the church. And then just a couple years later, he could say, well, actually, I think I was wrong about that. That's kind of embarrassing. I think that's embarrassing. I think that hurts your credibility significantly. And I think Martin Luther realized that this was embarrassing. He realized that this was a big problem for himself, because he goes on to say in the introduction or the preface of the prelude of Martin Luther on the Babylonian captivity of the church, he goes on to say, quote, "Would that I could prevail upon the booksellers and persuade all who have read them to burn the whole of my booklets on indulgences, and instead of all that I have written on the subject, adopt this proposition." And then he says, "Indulgences are wicked devices of the flatterers of Rome." So he's so embarrassed by this that he wishes he could go and seize all of the copies of his writings on indulgences and burn them and convince the publishers to stop publishing new editions of them. And then he says now that indulgences are wicked devices of the flatterers of Rome. So going back a couple years before he's writing this, in Thesis 71, he says, "Let anyone who speaks against the truth concerning papal indulgences be anathema and accursed." And now, just a couple years later, he says, "Indulgences are wicked devices of the flatterers of Rome." So which is it, man? What are we doing here? But it's funny because a lot of people credit the success, or I shouldn't say the success, but a lot of people credit the popularity of Martin Luther's ideas to the printing press. They say, Martin Luther's ideas spread so fast and were adopted so widely so quickly because of the printing press. And that kind of, that worked in his favor, obviously, but also that worked against him because a lot of the things he wrote early on in his rebellion against the church, in his rebellion against the fullness of Christianity, he wishes he could take back, but he can't because it's all out there now. It's all out there. It's being printed. It's been printed thousands of times, and everybody has a copy of those writings on indulgences, and he wishes he could take it back. So the real question is, which Martin Luther do we listen to? Do we listen to Martin Luther of 1517 and his 95 Theses, where he anathematizes anybody who rejects indulgences? Or do we listen to Martin Luther of just a couple years later, where he says that indulgences are wicked devices? Which one do we listen to? And is Martin Luther, according to himself, is he anathema? Is Martin Luther now anathema and accursed because of his rejection of indulgences? Or was he wrong when he anathematized those who reject indulgences? And if he could be so wrong and so confident in being wrong on one thing, then what else could he be wrong about? I think that's a very good question to ask. So yeah, and this brings up a dilemma for a lot of Protestants, I think, because Protestants, I can anticipate a lot of Protestants are going to say in response to this that, well, Martin Luther isn't our pope. There are a lot of things that Martin Luther said that we disagree with, and so we don't, just because Martin Luther said some crazy things doesn't mean that we have to accept it, and that's true. Martin Luther isn't your pope, although he seemed to think he had the authority to anathematize people, but that's a whole other conversation. But it does present kind of a difficult dilemma, doesn't it? I mean, if Martin Luther was wrong about indulgences, as he admits, if he was wrong about Mary, which many, even modern day Lutherans say he was wrong about Mary's Immaculate Conception and her perpetual virginity, if he was wrong on so many things, these core things, and he was so confident in his wrongness that he was willing to anathematize, then what else could he be wrong about? Could he also be wrong about the idea that you could leave the Catholic Church and still have a valid church? Could he be also wrong about the idea that he could ordain new priests? I think so. Could he also be wrong about the idea that apostolic succession, as many Lutherans, I think most Lutherans, if not all today, believe apostolic succession is merely ideological agreement with the apostles and doesn't have anything to do with a consistent laying on of hands from bishops that you can trace back to the apostles? So is he right about that? I don't think so. And I think that this whole little embarrassing incident really calls into question his credibility. But yeah, so you might be watching this video and you might be wondering, what are indulgences? What are we talking about here? What even is an indulgence? Well, I did an entire other video going into indulgences. I spent about 20 minutes just explaining what indulgences are, some misconceptions about indulgences, why Martin Luther affirmed indulgences. So if you want to go and learn more about indulgences, you can click this video here, or I'll also put it on the end screen. So go and check that out, and let me know your thoughts on this in the comments. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to like it and subscribe to the channel. Also consider going over to Patreon and supporting, where you will get, like I said earlier, a bunch of extra perks, exclusive live streams, a lot of behind the scenes stuff. I'm going to be releasing a series soon going through all of the mysteries of the Rosary, going in depth on each mystery and talking about a lot of the theological implications surrounding those mysteries. That is going to be a Patreon only series. So if you want to see that series, you have to go to Patreon and subscribe and become a member at the Sarah's Cafe level. Otherwise, you won't get to see that series, and that would be very sad. So go and check that out. And thanks again for your support. And until I see you next time, God bless. Cheers.